good, you're on.
All right.
Hey.
Okay. Welcome to Sovereign Grace Chapel this morning for our morning worship service as we look into chapter 28 of the book of Job. And when we come to this particular juncture of the book, just by way of review, we know that the interchange that has been going on between Job and the three friends has now concluded. And the three friends are not going to be heard from again. They've said what they've said, and there came a point where there was nothing more that they could offer or, compliment what they'd already said. So their dissertations, their speeches have come to a conclusion. But that's not to say there isn't going to be a fifth character that will be coming on the scene shortly. And there's another man that's been listening to all of the dialogue in the background, and he's going to come to a place where he's going to be given an opportunity to speak on this matter as well. We aren't there yet. So between the conclusion of the interchange between the three and Job and the commencement of the interchange between Job and this fifth person, we're right there in the middle where Job has several chapters here that he just wants to speak. And he's going to speak in a very reflective tone. And he's got a lot of different things that he wants to express. And that's part of what we're going to see here in chapter 28. What we're going to see also, I think, about Job in this particular area is Job's going to disclose a little bit more about himself, primarily about how he was treated in his former life, in his pre-afflicted life. And we're going to see a lot of things he says about himself. And I think it's interesting to kind of glean a little bit more about his personality and how he was viewed in his day. I think Job was a man of really very keen intellect, very thoughtful. I think he probably delved into deeply thinking about philosophical issues and religious issues. Obviously, he was a believer and had a relationship there that he enjoyed in obedience to God. But beyond that, I think he had a lot of capabilities in life. He was obviously a skilled businessman. I mean, he amassed to himself great wealth, and he was well respected, well thought of, very honored. In his own words, he was very honored by everyone around him. And when he walked into the room, he was like, he commanded the room. He was one that everybody looked to. He was in a position of leadership in whatever setting he was in. So he's quite a remarkable character in that sense. And I think he also demonstrated, at least he's saying this in his own words, and so we're taking what he says at face value, but he says that he had really a heart of compassion for people less fortunate than himself, and that he really looked out for the interests of others and sought to lighten the load of people that he came across in life. And so I think he really saw himself, at least, in a very, very favorable light. At least all those around him saw him likewise. But I just want to refresh our memories, and I always come back to this point about what is the starting point of the book. And of course, we know that there was this interchange of words between Satan and God in heaven, and Job's name came into the conversation. And Satan said of Job, does he worship you or not? He didn't say, do you worship, but does he fear you for nothing, Lord? And the basically point being that is Job just living in obedience and in fear of you because of what you can do for him? If you take all of the blessings away, is he still going to be in a posture of worshiping or fearing you? I I'm making the point, Satan is saying, that if you take all that away, he will curse you to your face. And so all of the things that are unfolding in the book have its root in that matter that went on in chapter 1 and then repeated in chapter 2. But here in chapter 28, he's going to give us, Job is, an assessment of what he believes is the most noble or the most valuable pursuit in life. And so he's being very reflective and thinking about things that he's observed in the world, and he's going to wonder about what it is that's really valuable, what is really important to pursue in life. And of course, I think we'll see in this chapter what he's referring to is the idea of wisdom. And he's going to be comparing wisdom to various things. But I think that perhaps Job has not arrived at the answer to the question that's burning in his heart, why has this come upon me? But he's coming to a place to know that he's not going to find the answer in what he calls the land of the living. He's coming to a place of really looking beyond what he can assess in the here and now. He's really seeing the answer lie outside of himself, outside of his friends, outside of his world. The answer lies out there. And it is a matter of wisdom that he must pursue if he's going to find the key to understanding his situation. Well, I don't think in this matter, the three friends, I think, that brought worldly wisdom to his ear really were representative. These three were representative of the broader culture. Because I don't think that if Job had 1,000 friends come to give him advice, that it would not change anything, because the wisdom that he's thinking he needs isn't coming from human thinking, and that it's got to come from another source. And I think that that's something that we Christians surely understand, that we need to have an understanding of the limits of human understanding. I think of the proverb 3:5, which says, do not lean on your own understanding. Well, that's in a sense what Job's coming to here. I can't lean on my own understanding. I've got to lean on understanding that's coming from other sources. And there is a limit to what man has in his capacity to comprehend or apprehend what is going on in this world. So I think that in thinking about this, I see that the Lord has created man with certain capacities that are certainly valuable and reflective, and that, yes, man is created in the image of God, but there is a limitation, obvious limitation, even in an unfallen state, of man's ability to comprehend the purposes of God in his infinite wisdom, in God's infinite wisdom. And so there is this limitation, and we must be sensitive to that, because our faculties do not afford us an ability to apprehend all of the things in this world apart from this thing that we're going to talk about this morning. And this is where Job is too, in his thinking as well. So when we look at the first 11 verses of chapter 28, and let me just read these 11 verses as we look at what he has to say here. Verse 1, certainly there is a mine for silver and a place for refining gold. Iron is taken from the dust and copper is smelted from rock. Man puts an end to darkness, and to the furthest limit he searches out the rock in gloom and deep shadow. He sinks a shaft away from inhabited areas. Forgotten by the foot, they hang and swing away from people. From the earth comes food, and underneath it is turned over like fire. Its rocks are the source of sapphires, and its dust contains gold. No bird of prey knows the path, nor the falcon's eye caught sight of it. The proud animals have not trodden it, nor has the lion passed over it. He puts his hand on the flint. He overturns the mountains at the base. He carves out channels through the rocks, and his eye sees anything precious. He dams up the streams from flowing and brings to light what is hidden. So here what we have Job describing is something of a particular industry or a particular human endeavor. And that is, in fact, the mining of the earth's ore is what he's bringing into the conversation. And why is he seemingly, of all the things that he might be discussing, why is he talking about the matter of mining for ore, mining for precious stones, and so forth? Well, what we see in verses 1 and 2, Job is talking about what we now know or call base metals. That is, he's talking about silver, gold, iron, and copper. All of these are contained in ore that is mined from deep under the earth. And all of these can be extracted by a process of smelting, they call it smelting. He's describing this himself in this chapter. It's a really interesting insight about the knowledge that somebody at that particular time in history had for being able to obtain these precious metals. And so the process is to take ore and you heat it up to a very, very high temperature. And by that process, you can separate the precious, such as copper, from the rest, which is called slag, and you throw that away. And so that's how even in the ancient world of Job, they were able to obtain these precious metals, and they found value in that. There was wealth in that. And so I would say that we here living in Colorado should be well acquainted with the mining industry. That's how the wealth of this state was established in the first place. You know, we live in the shadow of Pikes Peak and Cripple Creek and Victor, and great wealth was obtained by mining for precious metals up there. And so we understand some of the issues that he's talking about here. You know, the issue is that apparently in Job's time, as it is today, there's a knowledge that not every rock has embedded in its core certain precious elements that might be derived from it, such as silver or copper or iron. But you have to have a certain ability to discern and work through the various ores to see what's worth pursuing and what's not. And apparently in Job's time, they had that knowledge as well. They weren't just randomly going out and overturning the earth and looking for and smelting ore randomly. They knew that there were certain veins of minerals in certain formations, and they were able to obtain those by pursuing those veins. And the other thing that Job makes mention of here is, in a rather poetic way, he's talking about them creating shafts and going very, very deep down into the earth and looking for these things. So there was, the point that he's making is the great energy and effort that men went through to go get those minerals. The ability to cut through rock and to create tunnels and fortify them so they wouldn't collapse, and all of the things we know about present day mining that needs to take place. Job's generation knew that too. But the point is that the great amount of wealth and energy that went into going after those things that are deeply embedded in the earth's crust is what he's really making a point of here. So there was extreme skill, much effort and labor, But this was all done because they all perceived there was a great reward for going through all of this pain and going down into very dangerous situations and creating these tunnels, these shafts, and this ability to bring the ore to the surface and then to smelt it. And after all of that work, to come up with what? Some copper or some silver or what have you. So there was great amount of effort put forth because the rewards were great. You know, think about Colorado. There was a man by the name of A.V. Hunter, who was a man who came to Colorado Springs from, I believe he was born in Missouri in the 1800s, because of the great call to the West. Go west, young man, you're going to find your fortune there. Well, A.V. Hunter sure did. And he came, and ultimately he went up and lived in Leadville, but at that time it was called Ore City, O-R-E City. But now we call it Leadville. Well, he went up there, and he was able to establish a bank in Leadville. And by doing so, he was able to invest and support and provide financing for these miners and these mine companies to do what they were doing up there in Leadville to seek for these minerals. And so at age 32, he was up there in Leadville. And as time went on, he was eventually became very, very wealthy. He died in 1924 with an estimated net worth in today's dollars of about $35 million. The reason I know about A.V. Hunter is because he, upon his death, he set up a trust for the purposes of donating money or providing grant money to people with certain medical conditions that didn't have any wherewithal at all to pay for things. And so even today, you can apply for a grant through the A.V. Hunter Trust. A.V. Hunter was really a small potato compared to some who made their fortune up there. Think about Winfield Stratton, who now established the Myron Stratton home that we drive by every day when we come to church. Well, he ended up with a wealth of about $308 million estate when he died in today's dollars. Not to overlook Spencer Penrose, you know, who built the Broadmoor Hotel. At his death, he left an estate probably in the neighborhood of $220 million in today's valuation. Now, all of this because of rocks. All of this because of mining, going down in the ground and finding these ores and finding a way to extract them in a lucrative way. And look at the work that went into this, but look at the great wealth that came from it. And if you've ever been up to Cripple Creek, like Tina and I have been, you can go down to the bottom of the Molly Kathleen mine. And it's a little creepy, frankly, but you get in a little elevator shaft and you go down about 5 stories under the surface of the ground. And then they open up and you can walk around these tunnels where these men worked, digging out the gold that they could find down there. And so a great wealth was obtained in Cripple Creek and in Victor, in Black Hawk, and up in further north in Colorado. There was other gold mines as well. But there's almost this, what I would call almost insane drive in the hearts of men to go find that. How many thousands, I suppose, of men who came west seeking to find their fortune in the same endeavor of uncovering this ore found nothing. But the promise or the hope, the chance that just maybe you might strike it rich, was enough of a driver. As remote as that hope might be, there was still enough of a hope that people would leave everything, and they came from the eastern seaboard, from the Midwest, and they moved west not only to Colorado, but there was the great gold rush of the California in the mid-1800s too, and many people made a lot of money. A few people did, but the broad majority of people ended up destitute and expended everything they had for the hope. So there's this insane drive for wealth, is the point. And so you have this, it's almost like gambling, you have a few people that really purportedly make it big in a gamble of some sort, and that's enough of an incentive for you to go out and invest, not really invest, but risk your meager sum for the hope that you could really turn it into something more substantial. Well, it was a bit of like gambling, I suppose, to come out here and go after this ore, because they heard the stories of somebody like an A.V. Hunter or a Spencer Penrose or a Stratton, these guys who made so much incredible wealth. And even today, the city of Colorado Springs benefits from that because of the El Palmar Foundation. That's an endowment from the Stratton wealth from Cripple Creek Gold, that still a very, very wealthy organization that provides a lot of funds for improvements around the city of Colorado Springs. El Palmar does no longer own the Broadmoor Hotel, but they have other investments, and they're always seeking, and people go there to try to take a grant for various improvements that they want to make, and they'll consider those things. Well, this is the way of the world. This feverish, I would call feverish and frantic pursuit of wealth that's hidden under the earth. And Job's talking about it right here in these 11 verses. And what's the point here? Well, let's look at verses 12 through 22. But where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Mankind does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. The ocean depths say, "It is not in me," and the sea says, "It's not with me." Pure gold cannot be given in exchange for it, nor can silver be weighed as its price. It cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir, in precious onyx or sapphire. Gold or glass cannot equal it, nor can it be exchanged for articles of pure gold. Coral and crystal are not to be mentioned, and the acquisition of wisdom is more valuable than pearls. The topaz of Cush cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. Where then does wisdom come from? And where is this place of understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of every living creature and concealed from the birds of the sky. Abaddon and Death say, "With our ears we have heard a report of it." So now, all of this is being staged up for a contrast to something else that he is making the claim is even more important or more valuable to man than all of the things that he's been talking about with regard to what's under the earth, under the surface of the earth. And that is wisdom. Wisdom. What could be more important to our lives and well-being than massive wealth? When you think about the wealth that took place, $200 million, $300 million, I mean, that's pretty enticing, is it not? I mean, can you imagine being that wealthy? Well, a lot of people who have been that wealthy considered it a bit of a curse. It seems a little bizarre to our thinking, doesn't it? Because of the great responsibility. And also, you never know when you're that wealthy who's your friend and who's your leech. You know, as people wanting to attach themselves, befriend you because they're seeking to have a piece of the action, a piece of the wealth. And so many people who are extremely wealthy like this can never really know who their friends, true friends are. So it's not really what it's all cracked up to be in that sense. But even the men who amassed the great wealth like we're talking about, at the end of the day, and I mean at the end of their life, what did it really afford them? What did it really do for them? And they've left it off to trusts and other entities, to their offspring, to their descendants. They've willed it off to other people. And in the greatest sense of what they could do with it wisely, they sought to do it. But even that, all of that, they missed something that was more important in the eyes of Job anyway, something more important than all of that. Wisdom. Wisdom. And so he's making a comparison between all of that and this quality or this commodity, whatever you want to say about wisdom. That's what he's wanting to say is more important than that. Can we come to a place where we would rather have wisdom than $200 million? $300 million? How about $1 billion, $2 billion? How much money do you want, or would you conceive of, that would be the price of exchanging for wisdom? Or how much money, if you had it, would you give away or forfeit or be stripped of in order to obtain it? And this is where Job is. He's been stripped of his wealth. He was probably one of the most wealthy men of his day. And he's been stripped of all of it. And now he's coming to the conclusion that maybe there's something even more valuable than all of that. And he's really reflecting upon this. But wisdom in verse 12, where can it be found? And why would you say that wisdom is more valuable than the riches of gold and silver? What is it about wisdom that makes it so precious? And I'm making the claim that it's extremely precious, and I think that we Christians have something that we have inherited by our adoption into the family of faith that you would not want to forfeit for all the money that came out of Cripple Creek. You might think in the short run, boy, like the line in the movie It's a Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart's being introduced to Clarence, the visiting angel, and he's saying, Clarence says, well, we don't use money up in heaven. And Jimmy Stewart says in response, well, but it sure comes in handy down here. So it's kind of a funny line. But anyway, we have to come to a place where we understand that God is going to provide these things for us. And he's going to provide our necessities. He's not going to starve his children. He's going to provide. It's not going to mean that we're going to be provided with great luxury, but we're going to be provided with what we need and what's best for us. Most of us are not wealthy because we couldn't handle it. If we had it, we'd probably lose it in short order. We'd be duped, we'd be swindled, we'd be boondoggled, who knows. Most people can't handle wealth, and so even though they might be on the road to riches, they cannot figure out a way to keep it intact. But wisdom, somehow, some way, we have to come to an understanding that wisdom is more valuable than all these riches that we're talking about here. But where can it be found? You know, gold is found 5 stories underground. How far and how strenuous are you willing to put yourself to gain this thing called wisdom? Look at the effort that these miners went through. Look at the great risks that these people coming from the east to the west, you know, buying a horse and a pan and maybe a knapsack and who knows what, and going out and risking their lives to come 1,000 miles so that they might obtain gold. Look at the investment, look at the risk, look at the effort. What kind of effort and what kind of risk are we willing to take to obtain the thing that we're claiming is even more valuable? Wisdom. Well, look at verses 13 and 14. You know, he's saying he can't calculate it. What is the value of it? Mankind does not know its value. Well, we know the value of gold. It sells for $1,870 an ounce today. That's the value of gold. It can be calculated, the value of gold, and we can deduce its worth because we have some sense of what $1,870, how far does that take someone? Well, if you had an ounce of gold, You can equate in your mind what $1,870 will do for you. But how can you calculate the value of wisdom? It's kind of a rhetorical question. He's like, I don't know how to calculate it. How do you put a dollar value on it? But this wisdom that we are claiming to be so valuable, it's not found on the earth. It's not found under the earth. Nor is it found in the ocean, nor is it found beneath the sea. In other words, this thing, wisdom, that we're so claiming so valuable, it's not going to be found in the earthly realm. It's not something that's on or in or above the earth. It's somewhere else, outside of the created order, it seems as though. And in verses 15 and 16, he's making the point that the worth of it cannot be equated to dollars. It's beyond that kind of calculation. We're going to have to come up with a different system to be able to evaluate the value of wisdom. We're going to have to come up with a different calculator. You know, whether you talk about $200 million, $300 million, not able to buy even 1 ounce of wisdom. It's not even going to cover that. How can you convert, I should say you can convert a sapphire into dollars or dollars into sapphires. You can exchange gold for silver or diamonds for cash. You have all of these exchanges that can take place in the realm of these types of values, but wisdom doesn't equate to any of that. It's on a different level, a different world. And Job's wondering, how do you really even put a dollar value if that's the exchange of the day? How do you even try to evaluate it? And he's making the point that you can't, I think. You cannot evaluate it on that, in that way of thinking. But what we're trying to make the case for is that wisdom is of such greater value, and it's an incalculable value, that to have it is to be in possession of one of the most valuable assets that any human being could ever attain. Well, that's what he says in verses 18 and 19. The acquisition of wisdom is more valuable than pearls. So it's in a poetic way of saying it's more valuable than all of these things combined. There's just a certain thing that you have to come to a resolve on and not be consumed by the acquisition of all of these other worldly things that can be converted into a dollar and dollar into lifestyle, but rather it's something that's of inestimable greater wealth and benefit to man than all of the things that you can dig out of the ore of the earth. But what is wisdom? And why is Job making a point that it's so valuable? What really is wisdom? This elusive thing that's out there that can't be found anywhere, that's being claimed so valuable. Please help me. What is this thing called wisdom? You know, I think perhaps Job is seeking the answer to the perplexing problem of his vexation, I would call it, of what his situation is. He's coming to the point where the answer lies in wisdom. That's where he's going to have to go to find the answer. It's not going to be found in these other areas. And so I'm always kind of struck by this thing that I keep coming across in the book about Job's condition, and that his real perplexity, his real suffering, is a suffering of not understanding more than it is the suffering of the sores of his body and the affliction of his physical frame. That's certainly troubling. And it's troubling that he's lost his children. It's troubling that he's being considered, a throwaway human being by people who formerly loved him and esteemed him. All of that is certainly of grievous nature to him. But even over and above all of that, Job's greatest anguish is over the fact that he cannot understand why. And so we keep coming back to this. And so he's now going to think about wisdom, and that there is this thing out there that's going to give him the answer. He doesn't have the answer, but he thinks he knows the key to finding the answer. It's in wisdom. But alas, he says, wisdom is not going to be found in the land of the living, nor is it going to be found in the realm of nature. He's making reference to eagles are flying over. They don't understand it. A lion can walk along the surface of the ground, and he doesn't understand the wealth of the ore underneath. There is no way of finding these. He's not going to find wisdom in the natural realm. Well, that's kind of an interesting point, because that certainly flies in the face of more recent philosophical pursuits such as transcendentalism or romanticism. How about environmentalism? This pagan drive to esteem Mother Earth. Wisdom's not going to be found there, is his point. It's not going to be found in the natural realm. We can't look to the creation for this thing called wisdom. It's going to have to be found outside of that somehow, some way. And to drive the point home even further, look at verse 22. It's not even going to be found in the land of the dead, much less the land of the living. In Hades, in the realm of the dead, they've heard of something called wisdom. They're aware of the concept down there in Hades, apparently, but they haven't really got much more to offer as far as knowing where to go get it and what its value is. And so whether you're in the land of the living or the land of the dead, wisdom isn't going to be found there. So where does one go to get it? Let's look at verses 23 through 28. God understands its ways, and he knows its place. He's speaking of wisdom. For he looks to the ends of the earth, and he sees everything under the heavens. When he imparts weight to the wind, and he assessed the waters by measure. When he made a limit for the rain, and a course for the thunderbolt, then he saw it and declared it. He established it and also searched it out. And to mankind he said, look, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to turn away from evil is understanding. So Job in these verses is describing God's wisdom as it relates to the creation. And it's a remarkable thing. He's making the point. God's wisdom is revealed in the way that he put the created order together in such a fashion that would most perfectly allow for the habitation of man. And we've looked at this from scientific perspectives in our more recent days, how precisely the earth had to be composed in order to keep us upright and living day by day. Whether you talk about cosmology, the way that the earth is oriented in the skies or into the solar system, the rotation, the tilt, the wobble, the distance from the sun, or whether you're talking about the way that the composition of air is put together for the breathing apparatus of the human being. You're talking about the way that the food is provided, the vegetation, the animal life, all the things that we consume to sustain ourselves, all of these things are very delicately balanced in such a marvelous way that it actually can sustain and support life. And so the wisdom of God is seen in the good green earth. All the details here permit for what I'm talking about. And he says this thing in such a way. He talks about the weight of the wind and the limit of rain. I mean, these things have to be controlled by God in order that there not be a planet that would sustain or perpetuate human life. In verse 27, he saw it. I think what he's talking about here, God created it, and what he created is separate from himself. This is one of our cardinal doctrines, is it not? That God is separate and distinct from his created order. He's transcendent. The created order is not part of God. It's separate from God, although he is intimately involved in the operation of it, in the sustaining of it. But yet, without the creation, does not diminish God one bit. So he's basically saying he saw it, he declared it. Creation is a direct result of his express will and his decree. So he declared it to be what it is. So he's talking about God's wisdom here as it relates to the creation and how he brought it about. He established it. He brought it about from his mind to reality. This is what we call creating out of nothing. Basically, this establishment is to bring it about in time and space, separate from himself, and to put it into action and to create it in the fashion he did out of his own mind, out of his own thought process. This is what we have, this is what we are, this is what we see every day, is something that was actually preconceived in the mind of God. And he established it. And then he says he searched it out, he tested it. He created it in this verse. He created it for his own use. And it belongs to God. This creation that we inhabit, that we witness every day, is belonging to God. He created it. He established it. He declared it. He saw it. It's separate from himself. He tested it. And it belongs to him alone. And so there's something that is about all of this that I'm saying is the wisdom of God, is what Job is making a point of. Somehow this is wise in the way the world has been constructed. And he had to create it in such a fashion that man could be supported by its processes, both in the antediluvian world and the post-diluvian world, which are two different, really, environments, if you think about it that way. And yet we still can survive and prosper to a degree in the post-diluvian world. The wisdom of God. But now that we can look back and Christ has come, what we're talking about, this thing that belongs to God, is really now we understand by further revelation is going to be given over to Christ. It's for him. It's for the Lord Jesus, is the purpose of the created order. It's really a remarkable thing. And when the new heavens and the new earth come into being, it is being given as a gift from God the Father to God the Son. And we're just passive observers of this great gift that God the Father has determined, because it belongs to him, he's going to give it to the Son. But it's not quite there, because we know that there is a time yet where God the Father has to subdue the enemies of Christ and make them a footstool for his feet. And when God the Father has done that and put that matter to rest, then the whole of creation going to be inherited by the Lord Jesus. To me, this is one of the great purposes of the created order that we can think about. You can see it from a human realm. Okay, from a human realm, we are created to worship God and enjoy Him forever. That's from a human perspective. But from a divine perspective, I believe the creation is here as a gift from God the Father to God the Son. And He will be the ruler and adjudicate all things. It is His. The Lord Jesus, it is His. And of course, He's God as well. So in that sense, it's not going far from home as far as who's the ownership of it. But I think that's one of those things that we have to consider when we think about these matters of wisdom. So at present, the Lord Jesus is head of the church, but He's awaiting the time when the Father will subdue His enemies. And when that occurs, then He is going to be the head of all of creation. And yes, Jesus is the King of the universe by title. He's just waiting for the inheritance of His kingdom to come into play. And then that brings us to verse 28, which I think is the climax of the chapter. To mankind, He says, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. To turn away from evil. You know, wisdom is this capacity whereby a man can discern between good and evil. You know, I've been in many conversations in the last week about this very upsetting political thing that's going on in our world that might not end up in political conflict. It might be a more physical conflict. And the perplexity on people's minds as to why is it that people cannot see the evil that I'm seeing. And there's the answer to that is there's not wisdom in that. There's not an ability, a lack of ability to discern the good from the evil. And that's part of what we're talking about here in this context in verse 28, to turn away from evil, to be able to discern it and to turn away from it. And interestingly enough, he's making the point, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. We often say the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom in other places in the scriptures, particularly in Proverbs 1. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom. Fools despise wisdom. We're just talking about the most valuable thing that you can conceive of, more valuable than all the riches that you can mine out of this ground, is more valuable. Yet a fool despises it. Wouldn't you think that everybody would want to obtain wisdom? Wouldn't that be a natural inclination of man? Apparently not. Because fools who are not knowledgeable or aware of the ways of God are certainly opposed to the ways of God, and they despise wisdom. And so what you're seeing playing out in our political world right now is a despising of wisdom. And so people affirm and want to bring about something that is going to be very destructive to their own lives. It's, in a sense, rather self-destructive. But they don't have discernment. Why don't they have discernment? Because they don't have wisdom. Why don't they have wisdom? Because they despise wisdom. Do you see the connection there? So, wisdom is this perception, this ability to perceive right and wrong. Well, he also makes mention of knowledge of God. God reveals himself to those who reverently fear him. We often talk about knowing God. Do you know God? Well, it's going to take an act of wisdom to know God. So there's a sense, I think, in which you're not going, wisdom, I should say, is a vehicle by which you can apprehend the knowledge of God. There is no greater value to man than to know God in his true nature, in his true attributes, as he's revealed, the biblical God that we're talking about here. To know him, that's valuable. That's why I think you can make the claim that it's more valuable than all the ore in Cripple Creek, or all of the ore everywhere in the world, because it is the vehicle by which you can apprehend a knowledge of God in all of his perfections, to the degree that God has been pleased to reveal himself. Not that we know everything about God, but there's certainly a lot that he has been pleased to reveal about himself in the pages of Scripture. He didn't have to do that. Just think of the amount of self-disclosure that God has given us in the Scriptures. That's knowing God. That can only be apprehended if we have wisdom. And how do we get wisdom? Fear God. There's your point. There's your point of departure. And when you fear God and then you start moving into these realms of understanding, and you start to thrill in the knowledge of the Almighty that you could never ever have comprehended outside of the wisdom that comes from a fear of God. That's why it's so valuable. I would say God has created man for the very purpose of fearing him reverently and worshiping him and appreciating his perfections and his magnificence, what we call the glory of God. And the glory of God is a limiting word in some sense. The glory, when we say the glory of God, it's the best we can do about trying to, from a human perspective, speak of the magnificence of this being who has existed eternally and brought us into existence with an ability, a consciousness to be able to apprehend him. And so we struggle trying to really magnify God to the degree that he is deserving to be magnified. This is what makes it so valuable. Why? Because God says that's valuable. That's the highest good of man. That's the most lofty and noble pursuit of any human being, to know God. But you can't get there on your own avenue, by your own path. There's a key to this, and that is fear of God. Reverently fearing him, coming to a knowledge of wisdom, being able to discern good and evil. And what is at the heart of discerning good and evil other than knowing the perfections of God, which are good? And anything that doesn't emanate from him is evil. That's perception. That's wisdom. That's a real life, flesh and blood demonstration of a knowledge of good and evil. That you shun the evil. What are you doing when you're shunning evil? You're shunning that which does not emanate from God. How do you know that? Because you have a fear of God and you've entered into wisdom. And you can make that assessment. And for those who despise wisdom, shun the things that I'm talking about, what are they shunning? They're shunning good and embracing the evil. So maybe they do have, in that sense, some sense of discernment, but they're on the wrong side of the equation. I'm just trying to make the case of how valuable it is. Proverbs 2 says, if you seek wisdom as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. If you seek it as diligently as you would for silver, if you search for it as ardently as you would for hidden treasures. This relates back to what I was saying earlier, the amount of effort and energy that went into finding that gold in the bowels of the earth. We need to be as energetically and as fervent in our pursuit of wisdom. And this will result in the great, glorious reward of knowing God. Proverbs 8 says, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Hate evil? Yes, hate evil. That's why so many of us are so stirred up and so angry over what we see going on around us. You know, let me just say this though, we're very perceptive about this word, has been coined a rhino. You know what a rhino is, a Republican in name only, and we see them as rather traitors to the cause, like somebody inside the camp who's really working against our best interests as from the Republican Party standpoint, a rhino. But what about the Chino? What about the Christian in name only? Are we as indignant over them? Are we as perceptive about those people as we are the rhino? We have to think about that. That's probably the greater treason that has taken place in our country than the rhinos of the world, the Chinos, the Christians in name only. We're too willing to accept everybody into the camp as a brother. Well, how is it that we know that some Republicans aren't truly Republican? Shouldn't we not apply the same principle to the Christians who are not really a Christian? Shouldn't we really think about that? Proverbs 10 says, the fear of the Lord prolongs life, but the years of the wicked will be shortened. Live life wisely, wisdom, prudently. You know, prudence and wisdom are related, but they're not the same thing. Prudence is this ability to avoid doing the wrong or getting yourself into trouble. Prudence can be not necessarily entering into something of an evil, but not using good judgment. You can make certain financial decisions that weren't prudent, and you find yourself impoverished. But wisdom is not just avoiding doing something foolish. It's also actively knowing what to pursue that's good. That goes beyond prudence. Proverbs 15 says, the fear of the Lord is the instruction for wisdom. Fear God. There's got to be this reverence and exaltation of the name of the Lord. And then, having come to that point, you can be instructed in wisdom. Proverbs 16 says, by mercy and truth, atonement is made for wrongdoing. And by the fear of the Lord, one keeps away from evil. Keeping away from evil. This ability to discern good and evil, that's wisdom. That's true wisdom. The fear of the Lord leads to life. Proverbs 23, do not let your heart envy sinners. Do not envy sinners. We have a tendency to looking across towards a neighbor and say, gee, they have a nice life. Why can't I have that life? They're sinners. They're rank pagan, but they have a nice life. We shouldn't be envying what they have, but live in the fear of the Lord always, it says. Proverbs 24 says, my son, the fear of the Lord and the king. Do not get involved with those of high rank. Isn't that an interesting point? Isn't that an interesting point? When you get involved with those of high rank, what's the dangers, the pitfalls of that? Wisdom dictates you don't do that. Because when you get into a high-ranking position or associate with those who have power over others, you're going to find yourself tempted to do evil because you have power beyond what you can handle. Well, in summary, wisdom is that ability to discern or to judge what is true, what is right, and what is lasting. being able to discern that. This is what's so valuable about it. It's going to enhance our lives if we can really enter into a wise place of living life. This ability that we're talking about is more valuable than the gold and silver. And I would also say that wisdom is that rightful application of knowledge. Now, see, this is where the three friends went south. They had knowledge of God, but they didn't have the wisdom to apply it appropriately to Job. That's one of the big shortcomings of the three friends, a lack of wisdom. Did not know how to apply what was true knowledge that they had. It's one thing to have the knowledge, it's another thing to apply it appropriately. That takes this ability, and this ability comes from wisdom, and wisdom comes through the fear of God. Did the three friends have a fear of God? Maybe to a degree. Well, for Job, in his state, wisdom has become the most precious commodity, and he wants to understand the mind of God. And he's on the right track, would you not say? He's on the right track. Maybe he'll come to a place where the understanding of his situation will come upon his consciousness. With regard to this whole matter of apprehending God and seeing the value of wisdom over all other things, Paul had a word to say in Romans, and it's almost a doxology, but he said, "Oh, the depths of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and decisions, and how unfathomable and untraceable are his ways." And he was making that statement in the context, that's Romans 11, he was making that in the context of how God has worked it out for the salvation of the Gentiles by rejecting his nation Israel, but by saving the Gentiles, provoking the Jews back into jealousy so that they might ultimately be saved as well. Oh, the unsearchable riches of God. That was the context of him making that statement. And so he's just taking a pause and a deep breath and thinking about all of what God is doing in this matter of salvation to the world in general, not just Israel. Furthermore, in Philippians, he says, "More than that, I count all things to be loss." And Paul did lose a lot. We speculate that he lost his wife. We don't know for sure. It's not really spoken, but he certainly was married. Why don't we ever hear about his wife? I count all things to be loss. His position, his notoriety, his esteem among the Pharisees. Lose it all. Lose it all. Lose his position, lost his health, lost everything. He considered all things to be worthy of losing in view of what? The surpassing value of knowing Christ, Jesus my Lord, knowing God. Knowing Christ is to know God. I mean, we have a flesh and blood person we can look to and say, knowing him is knowing God. Isn't that a remarkable thing? He says, the surpassing value of knowing Christ my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things. Giving it up. Giving it up. To know Christ, to know Jesus Christ, is wisdom. The path to knowing him is wisdom. And the path to wisdom is fearing God. And I count these things to be mere rubbish, so that I might gain Christ. That's from a New Testament perspective. Well, we'll pick up with the next chapter next week. But these are things worthy of our contemplation, I would say. Thanks for your attention this morning. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord, we do thank you for this chapter 28. I pray that we give it due consideration about how energetically we want to pursue the fear of God and to obtain the wisdom that comes from it. I pray that we be very energetic, very industrious, that we exert ourselves day and night for the achieving of these things. For at the end of it, we know they're great riches for those who do so. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.